at her lowest point. No one was watching anymore. There are moments in a person's life that do not announce themselves. They don't arrive with urgency. They don't demand attention. They simply settle in and wait. This moment began without noise, without witnesses, without permission. A room held its breath. The kind of room where the walls feel farther apart than they should. The kind where time stretches, not forward, but outward, thin and uncertain. She sat there long after the day had ended, not because she wanted to, but because standing felt like admitting something had changed. The light remained on, untouched, as if turning it off might confirm what she wasn't ready to say out loud. Earlier that same day, her name had still meant something. It had weight. It had context. It had history. People once looked to her for answers, for reassurance, for direction. Her presence carried expectation. Her absence would have raised questions. Now, absence had arrived quietly, and no one asked why. The phone lay nearby, untouched. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no one left asking. Conversations had slowed, then stopped. Not all at once, but carefully, thoughtfully. As if everyone agreed without speaking, that distance was the safest option. What had been taken from her did not happen in public. There was no confrontation, no final conversation, no explanation delivered cleanly enough to be understood. Instead, it unfolded through subtle changes, a shift in tone, a pause before replies, a hesitation where certainty used to live, and slowly the world she recognized stopped responding the way it once did. She searched her memory for a clear beginning, a single moment she could isolate and examine. But every time she thought she found it, another memory surfaced, earlier, quieter, less obvious. A look exchanged across a room, a conversation that ended too soon, a question that never received an answer. What unsettled her most was not the loss itself, but the way it happened without acknowledgement, as though her place had been reassigned while she was still standing in it. There had been a time when her days followed a pattern she trusted, mornings that made sense, work that felt earned, relationships that felt mutual, a future that didn't require constant recalculation, that life didn't disappear overnight, it receded, and in its place came something harder to define, uncertainty. Not the kind that causes panic, the kind that settles into routine, the kind that makes you double-check your own memory. She began asking herself questions she had never needed before. Did I misunderstand what was happening? Did I miss something obvious? When did I become the problem no one wanted to explain? Outside, the rain continued, steady and patient. Inside, her thoughts circled the same few moments again and again, not searching for blame, but for clarity. What she found instead was silence. People who once spoke freely now chose their words carefully. Others stopped speaking at all. Support became conditional. Proximity became something to be negotiated rather than assumed. She noticed how rooms changed when she entered them, how conversations shifted just slightly off course, how familiarity gave way to formality, nothing overt, nothing provable, just enough to feel it, just enough to question herself. And that is how something important was taken, not by force, but by erosion. Her certainty, her sense of safety, her understanding of where she stood. When a person loses those things, there is no visible damage, no mark to point to, only the quiet realization that the ground no longer feels firm beneath your feet. This is not a story about sudden collapse. It is about a gradual removal of trust, of belonging, of the assurance that doing the right thing would be enough. And here, in this moment, unobserved, unprotected, she was left with a decision she didn't yet know she was making. Whether to disappear into the version of herself others seemed comfortable forgetting, or to hold on to something internal, something unspoken, that had not yet been taken. This is where her story begins, not at the height of success, not at the moment of recovery, but here, when the watching stopped and the quiet became unavoidable. Before everything changed, her life followed a rhythm she trusted. Mornings began the same way most mornings do for people who believe they are where they belong. An alarm that rang once, light slipping through curtains at a familiar angle, the quiet confidence of knowing where she needed to be and why. She moved through her days with intention, not urgency, not haste, just purpose. Work was not simply a place she went. It was a space she helped shape. People relied on her judgment. They listened when she spoke. Her name carried reassurance, not controversy. When she entered a room, there was an unspoken understanding that things would be handled properly. She didn't seek attention. She earned trust. Colleagues leaned in when she explained things. Friends called when they needed perspective. Family spoke her name with pride, the quiet kind that doesn't need to be displayed. There was comfort in that consistency. The sound of keys at the door in the evening, the familiar route home, music playing low while dinner cooked, messages exchanged without hesitation, plans made weeks ahead, not because she was controlling the future, but because she believed there would be one. Her relationships felt mutual, balanced, grounded. Laughter came easily. Conversations stretched without effort. Disagreements resolved themselves through honesty rather than distance. She was known, and she knew others in return. Belonging, when it is real, rarely announces itself. It shows up in small permissions. The freedom to be imperfect, to speak plainly, to assume goodwill without proof. She lived inside that assumption. Inside her, there was a quiet pride, not arrogance, not entitlement, just the steady satisfaction of having built something meaningful over time. She had worked for her place. She had learned when to speak and when to listen. She understood responsibility, not as a burden, but as a shared agreement, and she was planning, not in dramatic ways, not with grand declarations, but with confidence. Ideas she hadn't shared yet. Goals written down, then rewritten. Futures imagined carefully, realistically, with room for growth. She believed effort would be met with fairness. That clarity would be valued. That truth had weight. There were moments, small ones, that later would return to her memory with sharper edges. A conversation that ended too politely. A question brushed aside instead of answered. A pause that lasted just a second longer than expected. But at the time, they meant nothing. Because when life feels stable, the mind explains away irregularities. It assumes continuity. It fills gaps with trust. There were signs, not warnings, just inconsistencies. The kind that only matter once you know how the story turns. Her days were full then, structured, predictable in the best sense of the word. She knew where she stood with people. She knew what was expected of her. She knew how tomorrow would likely unfold. And when challenges appeared, as they always do, she met them with the same calm resolve that had carried her through before. Adjust. Respond. Move forward. She believed in systems, in dialogue, in accountability. She believed that if something went wrong, it could be addressed. That belief shaped how she lived. It shaped how openly she spoke, how freely she trusted, how little she guarded herself. The mornings still arrived on time. The city moved at its usual pace. Light still softened the edges of familiar streets. Old photos captured smiles that felt unremarkable then, because they were part of a life that seemed durable. Nothing suggested that durability was temporary. Nothing suggested that admiration could thin out, that respect could become conditional, that belonging could be revised without notice. And that is what makes this part of her story essential. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. A life built slowly. A place earned honestly. A sense of self grounded in contribution, not performance. When people speak of loss, they often imagine something dramatic, something sudden. But what she would lose later was not just position or connection. It was this certainty, this ordinary confidence, this unguarded way of moving through the world. Standing here, before the fracture, she had no reason to believe it would ever be questioned. The sky was calm, and no one looks for storms when the air feels still. The first crack did not arrive with force. It arrived as information, a sentence delivered without ceremony, a detail offered as though it were already understood, a moment that felt ordinary enough to dismiss, until it wasn't. It began with a conversation she hadn't prepared for. Not a confrontation, not an argument, just a statement placed in front of her calmly, as if it had already passed through every necessary channel before reaching her ears. There was an assumption built into it that she already knew. She didn't. At first, she laughed lightly, the kind of laugh people use when they believe there's been a mistake. She waited for the clarification that always comes next. The explanation that resets the room and restores balance. It didn't come. Instead, the room stayed still. Words followed, but they were careful, vague, measured, enough to suggest something had been decided, without revealing who decided it or when. She asked a question, then another. The answers didn't match. One version contradicted the next. Timelines shifted, details blurred, responsibility floated without landing anywhere solid. Disbelief came first, that instinctive refusal to accept what doesn't fit the shape of your life. She searched for context, for missing information, for the part of the story that would make it make sense. Surely this was a misunderstanding. Surely someone would correct it. She replayed the conversation later, word by word, listening for what she might have missed. She found nothing that justified the weight now pressing on her chest. So she did what people do when they believe in reason. She explained. She clarified. She offered facts. She trusted that truth would straighten what had been bent. For a brief moment it almost worked. Emails were exchanged. Conversations resumed. Carefully. A few people reassured her, quietly, that things would settle. That time would bring clarity. She wanted to believe them. Rationalizing came next. She told herself this was temporary, that tensions rise and fall, that institutions correct themselves, that fairness doesn't disappear overnight. She adjusted her tone, softened her language, gave more than was asked of her. Still, something felt off. She noticed how meetings changed shape, how invitations arrived later, or not at all, how people who once spoke freely now chose their words as if they were being recorded. Support remained, but it came with conditions, private, cautious, off the record, always framed as concern rather than confidence. "I just want to be careful," they said. "Until things are clearer," they added. Clearer for whom, she wondered, because clarity never reached her. Questions went unanswered, requests for explanation were redirected, statements replaced conversations. She began to sense a quiet agreement forming around her, one she was not part of. People were talking, just not to her. What unsettled her most was not the accusation itself, but its shape. It had no edges she could grasp, no source she could address, no version that stayed consistent long enough to respond to. Every attempt to understand seemed to produce another version of events. And then, the silence. Emails that once received quick replies now lingered. Calls went unanswered. Names that used to appear beside hers no longer did. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. She felt it in rooms that used to feel familiar, in conversations that now ended early, in the way people avoided eye contact when they thought she wasn't looking. Fear did not arrive all at once. It crept in through doubt. What if I don't know the full story? What if something is being said that I can't hear? What if silence is being mistaken for guilt? She asked directly at one point, calmly, professionally, what was happening. The answer she received did not answer her question. It circled it, reframed it, returned it to her without substance. That was when unease settled in, because systems that work do not avoid clarity. People acting in good faith do not fear questions. And yet, questions seem to make people uncomfortable now. She was advised to wait, to stay quiet, to trust the process. But the process no longer spoke to her. She began to realize something had shifted beneath her feet. Not enough to make her fall, but enough to make standing exhausting. This was not the collapse. This was the warning. A fracture running just deep enough to let doubt seep in, but not deep enough to explain the damage it would cause. And what she did not yet know, what no one told her, was this. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was still moving toward her, quietly, carried forward by decisions being made where her voice no longer reached. The silence had only just begun. What came next did not arrive all at once. It arrived in layers. The first loss felt professional, manageable, something she told herself she could survive. Responsibilities were reassigned without discussion. Decisions were made elsewhere. Her role narrowed, then blurred, then quietly stopped resembling the one she had built. She was still present, but no longer positioned, still included, but no longer consulted, still visible, but no longer trusted. At first, she treated it as temporary. She worked harder, documented everything, chose her words carefully. She believed effort would correct perception, but effort began to disappear into silence. And then came the second loss, community. The rooms she once entered without hesitation now felt measured. Conversations changed when she arrived. People who once defended her now avoided being seen doing so. Some stopped calling. Others offered distance disguised as concern. "I just don't want to be involved," they said. "Things are complicated right now." Complicated became the explanation for everything. Invitations slowed, then stopped. Group messages continued without her. Information reached her late, if at all. She learned about decisions after they had already taken effect. It was not hostility. It was worse. It was exclusion without acknowledgement. She began to sense that her presence carried risk for others. That being associated with her required explanation. That silence was safer than fairness. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, her world shrank. Then came the third loss. The one she did not expect, self-trust. She began replaying her own actions with scrutiny. Conversations from months earlier resurfaced in her mind, examined for hidden meaning. She wondered if confidence had been mistaken for something else, if silence had been misread, if speaking had been a mistake. Shame entered quietly, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that lowers your voice, the kind that makes you hesitate before entering a room, the kind that asks you to shrink yourself just in case. She started to monitor how she moved, how she spoke, how she was perceived. She became careful in ways she had never needed to be. At home, the weight followed her. Family noticed the change before she named it. Questions were asked gently at first, then less often, then not at all. Support remained, but it carried worry, and worry has a way of creating distance. Not because love disappears, but because people don't know where to place their faith when answers are unclear. She spent more time alone, not intentionally. It simply became easier than explaining. Friends disappeared in ways that were hard to challenge, messages left unread, promises postponed, plans cancelled without rescheduling. No one said goodbye, they just stopped arriving. Inside her, a quiet conversation played on repeat. Maybe I should have handled it differently. Maybe I trusted the wrong people. Maybe this is my fault. Fear followed close behind, not fear of danger in its obvious form, but fear of being seen, fear of being misunderstood again, fear that every interaction carried risk. She felt watched, not directly, not visibly, but in the way stories travel faster than corrections, in the way reputations move without consent. She noticed how quickly others seemed to know things she had never been told, how conclusions appeared before questions had been asked. Truth lagged behind perception, and perception was already moving on. She stopped defending herself out loud, not because she had nothing to say, but because each attempt seemed to cost her more than it gave back. Silence became a form of self-protection, but silence also isolated her further. Days blurred together. The structure that once defined her life dissolved. Without the roles she had built, she struggled to answer a simple question. Who am I now? Not in theory, in practice. When work no longer reflected her values. When community no longer reflected her character. When her own reflection felt unfamiliar. She woke up exhausted by decisions she hadn't made. Went to sleep carrying conversations she never got to finish. There were moments, small, unspoken, when she wondered how long a person could live like this. Not in despair, but in suspension, neither falling nor standing, just waiting. Waiting for clarity, waiting for truth to catch up, waiting for someone to say what everyone else seemed to already know. The piano thinned, notes stretched farther apart. And then, have you ever felt erased? She didn't know it yet, but this was the lowest point. Not because everything was gone, but because nothing made sense anymore. And when meaning disappears, even strong people begin to feel unrecognizable to themselves. This was the descent. Not dramatic, not loud, just deep enough to change her forever. After the fall, there was no moment of rest. There was simply continuation. Days still arrived. Tasks still needed to be done. Life, indifferent to meaning, kept moving. She adjusted, not because she felt ready, but because stopping entirely was not an option. This was not recovery. This was survival. Mornings became transactional. Wake, dress, eat something small. Leave the house or open the laptop. Complete what was required. Return. Repeat. She measured days by what had to be endured, not what could be enjoyed. Emotion dulled itself as a form of protection, not intentionally, not consciously. It happened the way numbness always does, slowly, then completely. Things that once stirred her felt distant. Music played without landing. Laughter from others sounded faint, as if coming from another room. Even pain lost its sharpness and became something flatter, heavier, harder to name. She learned how to function without feeling present. That, too, is a skill. She focused on practicalities, bills, deadlines, responsibilities that did not ask her to explain herself. These things obeyed logic. They responded to effort. In a world that no longer did, They became anchors. There were small victories, getting through a meeting without being overwhelmed, completing a task she thought she couldn't, making it through a day without replaying the same conversation. None of them brought relief, but they proved something important. She was still here. There were moments when she tried to reach out, carefully, selectively. She chose her words the way one chooses steps on unstable ground. She asked for guidance, for clarity, for support. The responses came back thin, polite but distant, encouraging but non-committal, supportive but temporary. Some offered advice without listening. Others listened without offering anything in return. A few promised help and never followed through. Each attempt cost her something: energy, hope, trust. Eventually, she learned to stop asking, not because she didn't need help, but because disappointment was becoming another thing she had to carry. So she carried things alone. She learned how to make herself smaller when necessary, how to avoid attention, how to move through spaces without inviting questions. Survival teaches efficiency. She conserved her strength, avoided unnecessary interactions, chose isolation not out of bitterness, but out of fatigue. Inside something hardened, not into anger, but into endurance. She didn't fight yet. She survived. That survival looked unremarkable from the outside. No speeches, no declarations, no visible defiance, just persistence. Getting up when it would have been easier not to. Continuing when no one was waiting for an outcome, holding herself together without an audience. There were nights when exhaustion overtook thought, when sleep arrived without dreams, when silence felt safer than reflection. And still, beneath the numbness, something remained intact. Not hope, not yet. Something quieter, a refusal to disappear entirely. She did not reclaim her life in this phase. She did not resolve what had happened. She did not correct the story being told about her. She simply stayed. And staying in circumstances like these is not passive. It is an act of endurance. Each day she survived without answers was a day she did not give away the last piece of herself. Each small unfinished day became proof that collapse had not completed its work. The audience might be tempted to look for momentum here, for progress, for a turning point. But this part of the story does not offer one. It offers something harder, the unresolved, the quiet continuation of a life stripped down to essentials. She did not heal here. She did not rise here. She learned how to remain. And sometimes, remaining is the only form of strength available. The piano holds the same pattern, unchanged, waiting, just like she was. The moment came quietly, a sentence, half heard, barely registered at first. She deserves better than this. It wasn't said to her, not exactly, but it landed anyway, as though the air itself had decided to whisper it into her ear. At first, she ignored it, pretended it didn't exist, pretended she hadn't heard. But then it repeated itself, not as words, but as a feeling, a pressure, a pulse inside her chest. She remembered herself, not the one who endured silently, not the one who shrank into shadow, not the one who waited for explanation, forgiveness, or recognition. She remembered who she had been, the one who acted, who moved, who shaped her world instead of letting it shape her. And then something shifted. The weight of all those days, those weeks, months, crashed down and collided with that whisper. She felt the fear, the exhaustion, the doubt, all at once. And yet beneath it, something new emerged. A spark, sharp and raw. If I don't reclaim myself, no one else will. She repeated it silently, like a mantra, testing the words against the walls of her mind. This realization was not gentle. It did not soothe. It struck. Fear rose immediately afterward. Not gone, not quiet, but focused. Focused into clarity, focused into awareness, focused into strategy. She began to notice things she hadn't before, small gestures of avoidance, tiny distortions in truth, patterns she had accepted out of habit. No longer hunted blindly, no longer passive. She started to set boundaries quietly, deliberately. A conversation paused before it could go further. An email left unsent because it would expose more than it protected. A decision made based on instinct, not permission. Every choice carried tension, every action a test. Every look over her shoulder a reminder that danger had not disappeared. And yet the energy, the alertness, was intoxicating. The realization was clear. Survival alone was no longer enough. She needed to act, not with force, not with revenge, with herself as the only authority. This was the first act of self-trust. It was small, almost imperceptible to anyone else. But to her, it was seismic. She began noticing micro-wins, choosing where to invest her attention, saying no where she had once said yes automatically, protecting her energy. The world did not immediately reward her. The threat did not vanish. The people who had abandoned her did not return. And yet, for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of control. It was fragile, precarious, electric, like standing on a ledge and realizing you can jump or fall. But this time, she didn't fall. She leaned into the spark, breathed through the tension, and began to reclaim the space inside herself that no one else could touch. Fear was still present. It had sharpened, not dulled, but it had purpose now. She was no longer simply surviving. She was beginning to respond. And the roller coaster of emotion, the anger, the grief, the exhaustion, the defiance, rose in her chest like storm waves. It terrified her. It energized her. And she realized this was the edge where transformation begins. Not soft, not pretty, but undeniable. The first steps were quiet, not celebrated, not noticed. She began to move through her days differently, not because the world had changed, but because she had. The routines that once felt like survival became tools for rebuilding. She returned to small practices, writing down thoughts she could barely admit aloud, organizing tasks that gave her control over fragments of her life, sitting in silence long enough to hear herself again. Healing didn't arrive loudly. It arrived consistently. Some mornings she walked before sunrise. The city was still, the streets empty, and she moved without interruption or expectation, each step measured, each breath deliberate, each motion a reminder that she could still navigate the world on her own terms. She learned new skills, not flashy, not immediate, skills of discernment, of patience, of restraint. Therapy sessions became spaces where she could speak without fear. Journals filled slowly, pages bending under the weight of things she had kept hidden. Faith, once background noise, offered subtle grounding. Even solitude became an ally, teaching her that being alone didn't have to mean being diminished. Every small action carried significance. She learned how to say no without apology, how to honor herself without expecting applause, how to protect her boundaries without resentment. Old versions of herself, the version that trusted too quickly, that gave too freely, that sought validation externally, were let go, one careful layer at a time. Not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Strength was no longer defined by visibility or recognition. It was measured in consistency, in the ability to show up for herself, quietly, daily. She noticed patterns in her thinking, learned to pause when fear whispered, learned to assess before responding, learned that power could be subtle, rooted in presence rather than performance. Some days brought frustration. Some days brought doubt. But in those moments, she remembered the spark from the turning point, the awareness that she had chosen herself first. Even small victories felt monumental. Completing a day without exhaustion, speaking a truth without apology, allowing herself to rest without guilt. She moved through the world like one rediscovering terrain. Every corner, every street, every room held familiar elements, but she now navigated them differently, alert, present, deliberate. And slowly, imperceptibly to others, she began to reclaim her life, not with fanfare, not with noise, but with consistency, with intention, with the quiet knowledge that the rebuilding, though unremarkable externally, was irreversible internally. Healing, she discovered, was less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about subtle shifts. Dawn light through the curtains, the slow accumulation of pages in a notebook, the rhythm of feet hitting pavement during long walks, the comfort of boundaries respected by no one but herself. In silence, she was learning to become whole again, and in that quiet reconstruction, she discovered a new kind of strength, not the strength that demanded attention, the strength that survived absence, betrayal, and doubt, and emerged quietly, undeniably, intact. The world had not changed. The challenges had not disappeared. The people who had abandoned her did not return in grand gestures. The wrongs committed were not erased. Life was not perfect, and yet it was hers again. She moved through her days differently now, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with confidence that had been forged quietly, through months of endurance and small acts of reclamation. Confidence no longer relied on recognition from others. It was internal, deliberate, unshakable. She spoke her truth where it mattered, acted with intention, and chose carefully where to invest her energy. She had learned that power does not always announce itself. It grows silently, unnoticed, until it is undeniable. The threat, once looming and oppressive, had diminished, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. Her choices, her boundaries, her quiet self-possession had rendered it powerless. She still carried scars. They were not hidden, but they no longer defined her. She recognized them as markers of survival, not weakness. Each one told a story of endurance, of lessons learned, of limits respected. Somewhere along the way, forgiveness